This revision session is on the miracles topic. It's important to keep in mind, as ever, the philosophical questions. These should appear throughout your essay, obviously relevant to the particular question or philosopher that's mentioned in the exam question. But keep these in mind because they help you with your analysis and setting the context of your essay and your discussion, especially in your introduction. So there's a range of ones. The big one is actually, what is a miracle? There's not been a past paper question about critically assessing what a miracle is. They tend to look at Hume or Maurice Wiles, or particularly on biblical miracles and the philosophical issues, but it's important to show that you are aware that there are different ideas of what a miracle is. So be prepared to have that somewhere in your discussion. So there are three main broad definitions of miracles. So you have the traditional ones, most notably said by Hume, which are the natural law definitions, this idea that they break a law of nature. Others say, well, they might break a law of nature, but they're not just about that supernatural event. They're about revealing something about God or having a good or religious purpose to them. And this is something we see in this quote from Swinburne, where he says, if a feather landed here rather than there, we wouldn't really call that a miracle, even though you might say, well, that feather should have landed there, so a law of nature has been broken. He says that's not really a miracle, because what we suppose a miracle is something that has a good result, that has some kind of purpose or reveals something about God. And then we have more modern versions of them. They tend to be called contingency definitions, and I'm not sure if this is the reason why they're called contingency definitions, but how I help myself to remember it is that something which is contingent is dependent on something else, and these definitions become more dependent about how that event is interpreted rather than on it breaking the law of nature. So Aquinas' view on miracles is worth knowing because you can pull out some of the elements to use to talk about Hume and other ideas of miracles. He's not on your specifications, so you don't have to know him too much, but he very much says that a miracle is a divine act. So it's not something that you interpret as a miracle, it's something which is by very nature is an act of God, so it's a different type of event. And he says, the miraculum, the Latin for miracle, the derivative of it, means wonder, but he says it's not just something that you think is wonderful, like a baby being born, that's wonderful. It's something which is intrinsically wonderful, that everyone, no matter what interpretation, you would accept that it is wonderful, because it's the nature of the event. And he has three different types of miracles. So we have an event that's done by God, which nature couldn't do, which we might say is closer to that natural law definition. For example, in Joshua chapter 10, when the sun stops in the sky, an event done by God which nature could do, but not in the order. So normally people go from being seeing to becoming blind. So if someone went from being blind to having sight again, that would be type 2. And then we have the third type, which is something nature could do, but it's maybe not using the principle. So if my broken arm healed very, very quickly, it would heal normally through nature, but not as quick. So that would be the third type. And why these are important is because they're showing that just saying that a law of nature has been broken is maybe a simplified idea of what a miracle is. Aquinas is identifying different ways that we might understand that God has intervened and acted in the world. Now, the most famous critic of miracles is Hume, and there are 5 main criticisms. There is one which is his argument from induction, which is the one that's going to argue that they're irrational. And then we have the other 4 that are about the testimony of miracles, people telling you about them. So his first critique of miracles is an inductive argument. And induction is where you infer things based on experience, things that have happened. So he says laws of nature are highly probable because they're based on countless observations. And the more you observe something, so if I was to drop my pen, it would fall to the ground, and the more that happened, the more certain that law of nature becomes. And then he says, by definition, remember his definition from one of the earlier slides, a transgression of the law of nature by a particular volition of deity. He says, by that very definition, a miracle breaks these very, 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 very probable laws of nature. And so they're always going to be outweighed by the evidence, because there's going to be more evidence that that law of nature continued happening than the miracle, which is a one instance, happened. It will always be outweighed by the evidence, and he argues it's irrational to believe in the highly improbable, and therefore miracles are highly improbable and highly irrational to believe in. So he's not saying, and this is important because some textbooks get this wrong, he's not saying they don't happen. He's not saying laws of nature are fixed either, and that's important because the examiner's reports pick up on that. He is saying that they are just irrational to believe in, that the evidence for them is outweighed by the countless and countless observations of the law of nature happening. So I think a really good way in your essay to demonstrate you understand Hume's point is by using the example of Jesus' resurrection. So we've got one instance and the gospel evidence of people's testimony that Jesus resurrected, but we have billions and billions and billions of people have died and then not risen from the dead. So why, he would ask, would we accept that one instance over the evidence that billions and billions of people have not risen from the dead? So the other criticisms about the testimony, and these are really quite straightforward to criticise, which we'll come on to, but if we look at his first one, is about that there hasn't been enough men, of an educated men, to testify, to say that a miracle had happened. And then he argues that belief in miracles is actually mainly found amongst ignorant and barbarous nations, which we might question, what does he mean by that? How is he judging that? And then he argues that it's almost part of wish fulfillment, that people get so excited and want the miracle to have happened that they just talk about it like it has without really thinking about it, and they'll spread and talk about it. And then he argues that because there have been miracles across lots of different religions, that it would make sense for them all to be true, so they kind of cancel each other out. So there are quite a few criticisms of Hume, and you can get an essay solely on him, so we do need to know them. So Hume's first argument suffers from the logical problem of induction, and this is a sort of circular argument because he bases his argument in induction, inferring from experience, but the only evidence for induction is more induction itself, so it becomes a circular argument. Also, there's many questions about what does he mean by the level of education, what does he mean by sufficient number, how many would it have to be? And also you can use some of your religious experience subject knowledge about Swinburne, and he would argue to Hume that with the principle of testimony, that we should actually trust people's testimony more than what Hume suggests. And many people would argue that Hume's definition and his whole inductive argument that the more and more something happens, the more certain it becomes, is actually based on an outdated view of science. As we saw in the religious language unit, it's about falsification, being open to falsification, rather than about itself true. You could criticise his idea that the different religions cancel each other out by using William James's pluralist approach to religious experience, by saying, well, maybe they're just all evidence for one God who shows himself in different ways to different cultures, and they just interpret their experience according to their religion, but it's the one and same God. Clark, interestingly, says that Hume is almost, even though he's not saying they don't happen, he's implying that they're almost impossible because they're so irrational to believe in. And he says he's confused improbability with impossibilities. They have to be unusual because they would cause issues with free will. They couldn't happen all the time, but that doesn't mean that because they're so improbable and infrequent, doesn't mean that they don't happen. And Vardy kind of picks up on this, and he says that we shouldn't see laws of nature as almost set in tablets of stone and nothing can go against them, because actually if we look at science, their understanding of the laws of nature changes a lot. And also we need to remember that the Catholic Church has tried to verify miracles at Lourdes, and it's quite strict on doing that, but over 70 miracles have been. So Richard Swinburne, he's also not on your specification, but he's one of those where even though he's not in your specification, they'll expect you to refer to him. So he defends miracles against Hume, and he raises many of the criticisms we've just discussed. But he also says that we need to remember that if we believe in an omnipotent God, it would make sense that he would be able to suspend the laws of nature if he wanted to, and we can't expect him to do it too much because it would interfere with our free will. And also, Hume kind of discards that there could be any evidence for the miracles that are happening, so x-rays, medical evidence, witness testimony, and coupled with his principle of testimony, you could argue that that witness testimony should be trusted. If we normally trust those people, and using the principle of credulity, if we normally would trust that they understand and interpret their experiences normally, then why wouldn't we about a miracle? Now, although you may be more familiar with his commutative argument when you're talking about religious experience, I think you could use it in miracles as well. So, Swinburne's commutative argument is that on their own, so a bit like leaky buckets, the different arguments for the existence of God don't really demonstrate that God exists on their own because they have problems. But if we add them all together, and I would argue maybe if you add miracles into that mix, then maybe they make God more probable than not. In the same way that if you put lots of leaky buckets together, they will be able to hold water. But some people would argue in the end you've still got leaky buckets, and wouldn't you prefer a bucket without leaks in it? Now, your other main scholar that you need to know for the miracles unit is Maurice Wiles. He's really interesting because he's not criticising the lack of evidence for miracles, the lack of satisfactory testimony like HUME'S. He's just arguing more from a theological stance, and he's saying actually believing in miracles is problematic to the very nature of God. So miracles have to be infrequent, because if they happen too much they wouldn't be a miracle. And he says when we look at the pattern of miracle, there seems to be something odd. Either they suggest that God is arbitrary, and that means that he's just picking people at random, but that would raise issues that doesn't seem very fair or loving, that he's just picking at random. Or he's partisan, that means has favourites. But then again, that questions his love and his fairness. So he says, really, either of those are not satisfactory. So this leads him to say that it doesn't make sense for God to intervene in these one-off instances as miracles. Instead, he suggests that God's action in the world is more this one sustaining act of creation rather than these interventionist miracles. And he uses examples like Auschwitz and Hiroshima to say, well, you know, if we accepted that God intervened with miracles, we're left with the question, why did he do nothing there but then turn water into wine, or heal one-off people every so often? And for him, that is such a challenge that he can't deal with that. Now, the problem with Maurice Wiles is many people might argue, what do we do with all the miracles in the Bible? This is the sacred scripture. Some of the miracles are really crucial, like Jesus' resurrection, the incarnation of Jesus, the virgin birth, Jesus' own miracles, which demonstrated he was the Messiah and the Saviour and something different. Wiles would argue, well, what we have to do is look at the biblical miracles and see them more as having symbolic value and teaching us about the nature of God. So instead of seeing Jesus' resurrection as this supernatural event, we need to see it more as symbolising God's power over death and that the hope of life after death, rather than as a supernatural event. Now, our last type of definition, so rather than one that just solely focuses on breaking the law of nature like Hume, one like Swinburne and others like Stephen Evans and others you may have studied, who say it's not just about breaking the law of nature, but it's also about the significance and the purpose of that miracle and what it reveals about God. You have the contingency definitions, and the most famous contingency definition is from R.F. Holland, and he tells the story of a child that's on the railway track and the train stops just in time, and the mother observed this and she interprets that as a miracle, and she feels to herself that it's a miracle and it has an effect on her and a lasting feeling that this was something special. Now, when they look at it, actually it turns out that the driver didn't have much to lunch, and he fainted, his blood sugar level dropped, and the dead man's lever came into play because his foot came off, or his hand came off the lever, and so it automatically stopped. So it can be explained, and so we might see that that was a happy coincidence. Now, what Holland says is that a miracle can be a series of coincidental events that can be interpreted religiously as a sign and called a miracle. So what's key to Holland's is the interpretation of the event. So for the mother, it is a miracle and it has an effect on her and a lasting impact. Whereas for others, they might say it was a happy coincidence. It was a series of coincidental events. Now, an issue with his idea is we are left wondering, is Holland saying that God is at play here, or is he not? And some people have said it's leading to a non-cognitive approach to miracles. And this is that they're just about your opinion, your interpretation of that event. And some people might find that problematic. They want to say that a miracle has happened and God does intervene as a factual, cognitive statement. Now, what you could do if you wanted to say, well, maybe it is non-cognitive, maybe they are interpretations, maybe this is the best way. And what you could do is use people like Maurice Wiles to help you with that, because he takes a similar approach to the Bible, that we have to see them more as symbolic. But then a positive of Holland's is that it avoids all of the issues with the laws of nature definitions. It avoids the issues of Maurice Wiles, because it's not actually, you could argue, God intervening. It avoids all of the issues of Hume's criticisms, because you've changed the definition. If you change the definition of what a miracle is, Hume's criticism doesn't work and Wiles's criticism doesn't work, because they're about God intervening in a very direct way and maybe changing the laws of nature. You also can get a question about the biblical concept of miracles, and it's about understanding the purpose of them, what they communicate, and thinking about, do they raise any philosophical issues? So you might argue that they raise issues like Wiles would say, that God appears to have favourites. You might say, well, some of the miracles actually might question God's omnibenevolence because of what happens. For example, during the parting of the Red Sea, that leads to the drowning of many Egyptian soldiers. Is that a benevolent God? Well, someone might say, well, the purpose of it was that he was saving his people and keeping the covenant, but it's still a question to raise. Or when, during Joshua 10, when God is on Joshua's side and he helps him defeat the 5 kings, they destroy and kill all of the people of the 5 kings, their armies, everyone. And you might argue, does that make sense for a benevolent God to intervene in that way and be part of the sort of killing of masses and masses of people? Now, another scholar who's very useful, and this is our last scholar for this session, is Bultmann. So Bultmann is useful for any kind of modern perspective where someone has said, well, maybe actually what we need to do, a bit like Wiles is saying, maybe we need to reinterpret the biblical miracles. He argued that the Bible needed to be demythologized, stripped away of the layers of myth, so that we could get to the essential message of the Gospels, which he called the kerygma. He said that at that time, the disciples and the Gospel writers added layers of myths, and it was part of the way that they were trying to sort of talk about Jesus and what he meant to them and how special he was. And he says that we now need to demythologize, and I've always used the image of the Ferrero Rocher. So the kerygma is like the hazelnut in the middle, and we need to get rid of the layers, the nuts, the wafer, the praline and everything to get to that essential message. And so a positive of that is that we avoid the issues raised by people like Wiles. We avoid issues of, for example, Jonah being in a giant fish for 3 days, how there were 10 plagues, and all of those issues that people might find with parts of the Bible. But you do raise issues of, well, for some people they would find Jesus' resurrection, Jesus performing miracles, as crucial to the faith, and that they would find it difficult to know also how far do you go with the demythologizing. How do you know which parts are myth and which parts then are the kerygma, and how far do you go? And if we do that to the Gospels, do we do it to all of the parts of the Old Testament? And then what are we left with?